James was constantly humiliated for his simple life. His car was covered in mud, and taunts were heard in every hallway of the school. But when the truth about his family came to light, things changed. What will James do when he finds out that everyone started treating him differently just because of his father? Be sure to subscribe to find out how James handles the new challenges. And post in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sound of his car's engine echoed in the otherwise silent parking lot. The vehicle sputtered, as if struggling with every push of the accelerator. It wasn't new, it wasn't flashy, and it certainly wasn't what the students at the prestigious Western Academy were used to seeing. As James turned into the lot, he caught the first glimpse of his new world. Rows of luxury cars, Mercedes, Audis, even the occasional Porsche, lined the student parking. His old sedan, with its faded paint and worn tires, stuck out like a sore thumb. James gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, feeling the familiar sting of nervousness knotting his stomach. He had been preparing for this moment for years. His hard work, long hours of study and dedication, had earned him a place in one of the top private schools in the country. But standing on the threshold of it now, the magnitude of his challenge hit him. This place, with its high-end students and sprawling campus, was nothing like the neighborhood he grew up in. He was about to step into a world where his achievements might not matter as much as the car he drove or the clothes he wore. James parked at the very back of the lot, away from the gleaming luxury vehicles. As he got out, he felt eyes on him. He glanced up to see a group of students standing near their cars, talking amongst themselves. The conversation seemed to stop as they noticed him, and a couple of them gave a curious glance at his car, followed by a chuckle. He didn't need to hear the words. He knew exactly what they were thinking. "Who's the guy with the rust bucket?" One of the boys, dressed in designer clothing, snickered, his voice loud enough for James to catch as he walked past. The others laughed along, their laughter echoing across the lot. James clenched his jaw but kept his head held high, refusing to let their mocking laughter affect him. The school building loomed ahead, a towering structure of brick and glass that seemed almost too pristine, too perfect. James had read all about Western Academy, its history, its elite status, its reputation for excellence. But none of the brochures or online videos had prepared him for the reality of being here. Walking through the front doors felt like stepping into a different universe. The hallways buzzed with activity, students moving between classes, chatting and laughing. He noticed the same pattern: expensive clothes, perfect hair, the unmistakable aura of privilege that seemed to coat the air around them. As James passed by, a few students glanced his way, some giving him quick, disinterested looks before returning to their conversations. Others didn't bother to hide their curiosity, staring openly at him as though he were some foreign entity that didn't quite belong. James had anticipated this reaction. He wasn't naive. He knew that coming from a different background, being a black student at a predominantly white elite school, would make him stand out. But he hadn't expected it to feel quite so isolating, not this quickly. He made his way to his first class, his backpack slung over one shoulder, trying to stay focused on the reason he was here. This was his opportunity to prove himself, to show that he belonged, not because of his father's position, but because of his own hard work. He refused to rely on the influence or status of his family, especially his father, who happened to be the school's director. No one here knew that, and James intended to keep it that way. Inside the classroom, students were already seated. He scanned the room, looking for an open seat. Most of the students sat in groups, their seats taken next to friends. In the back of the room, he saw an empty desk. As he moved toward it, he noticed a few students glancing his way, their eyes following him. A girl with perfectly styled blonde hair whispered something to the boy next to her, and they both laughed quietly, casting quick looks in his direction. He sat down, ignoring the undercurrent of whispers and stares. The teacher, Mr. Harper, entered the room, and the low hum of chatter died down. Mr. Harper was a tall, stern-looking man with sharp features and an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. He began the class with introductions, asking each student to stand up and say a little about themselves. When it was James's turn, he stood up, feeling the weight of the room's attention shift entirely onto him. He could feel the judgment, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. "I'm James," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I transferred here this year." "Where from?" Mr. Harper asked, his tone polite but distant. "From a public school," James replied, keeping it simple. He could almost hear the unvoiced assumptions settling into place in the minds of his classmates. Mr. Harper gave a curt nod and moved on, but James could feel the lingering stares as he sat down. The rest of the class passed in a blur, with James doing his best to focus on the lesson rather than the constant low buzz of whispering that seemed to surround him. By lunchtime, he had already heard enough snide comments to know that the next few weeks would be tough. He overheard conversations as he passed through the halls, students talking about his car, his clothes, even his skin. They didn't bother to lower their voices much. "Can you believe he's driving that piece of junk? I bet he's on some kind of scholarship. Why'd they even let him in here?" James kept walking, his face expressionless, but inside, every word cut. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. By the time he sat down for lunch, alone at a table near the corner of the cafeteria, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. His goal was to make it through the day, one step at a time. But the road ahead looked steeper than he had imagined. As he picked at his lunch, trying to tune out the noise around him, someone slid into the seat across from him. He looked up to see a girl, dark hair, glasses, wearing a simple but stylish outfit. She smiled at him, though her expression seemed slightly awkward. "Hey, I'm Sarah," she said, her tone casual but friendly. "You're new, right?" James nodded, surprised that someone was actually talking to him without mockery in their voice. "Yeah, just started today." She nodded in return, her eyes scanning the room briefly before returning to him. "Don't mind them," she said, tilting her head slightly toward the table where Dylan and his friends sat, still laughing about something. "They're all just full of themselves." James shrugged. "I'm not worried about them." Sarah smiled again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good. They're not worth it." She paused, then asked, "So, what brought you to Weston?" The question caught James off guard. He could feel the weight of his secret, that he was the son of the director, pressing against him. But he had already decided that he would keep that part of his life hidden for now. "Just looking for a fresh start," he said simply, giving her a small smile in return. Sarah seemed to sense there was more to the story, but didn't press. Instead, she nodded, glanced around the room one last time, then stood up. "Well, good luck with everything. If you need anything, just ask." As she walked away, James felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't all bad. But as the rest of the day unfolded, he was reminded that for every kind person like Sarah, there were plenty of others who would make his life here difficult. The days that followed were harder than James had anticipated. The low whispers and mocking looks hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more open. Every day it seemed as though another group of students took it upon themselves to remind him that he didn't belong at Weston. And while the students made his life difficult in subtle ways, the worst of it came from Dylan and his group of friends. Dylan was one of those students who seemed to have everything: wealth, popularity, and power over his peers. His father was a powerful businessman, and it was clear that Dylan had inherited the sense of entitlement that came with that. The moment James walked through the doors of Weston, Dylan had taken an interest in him, but not in a friendly way. From the first day, Dylan had made it his mission to ensure that James felt like an outsider. One afternoon, as James was heading out to the parking lot after a long day of classes, he noticed something odd. A small group of students had gathered near his car. At first, he thought maybe they were just hanging out nearby, but as he got closer, he saw Dylan standing at the center of the group, laughing loudly. James's heart sank. He approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The closer he got, the clearer the scene became. His old car, which was already in bad shape, had been smeared with mud and debris. The windshield was covered in splatters, and the tires had clearly been kicked, leaving dirt all over the sides. "Hey, James," Dylan called out, grinning as he saw him approach. "Is this your ride? I mean, seriously? I didn't know people still drove junkers like this." The group erupted into laughter, some of the girls covering their mouths, while others laughed openly, enjoying the spectacle. James clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white, but he kept his composure. Inside, though, his blood boiled. "Why do you even care?" James asked, his voice calm but with an edge that betrayed his frustration. Dylan raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "Care? Oh, I don't care. I'm just curious how you managed to park this thing in the same lot as us. I thought this was a school for people who could afford something a bit more, presentable." James stared at Dylan, his chest tightening with anger. But he didn't respond. He knew that was exactly what Dylan wanted. A reaction, an argument, something that would fuel the fire. So instead, James walked past them, reaching for the driver's door handle. His fingers brushed against the muddy surface, and he could feel the grime sticking to his skin. "Oh, come on, don't be like that," Dylan said, stepping closer. "We're just having some fun, right? I mean, look at you, James. You don't really fit in here. We all know it. You know it too, don't you? Why pretend?" The words hit James harder than any physical blow ever could. He knew Dylan wasn't just talking about the car or the clothes. He was talking about James himself, his skin, his background, everything that made him different from the rest of the students at Weston. For a moment, James wanted to scream at him, to shout at the top of his lungs that Dylan didn't know anything about him, but instead, he swallowed the rage and opened the door, climbing into the driver's seat. As he turned the key in the ignition, the car sputtered to life, the engine groaning as it had so many times before. Dylan stepped back, smirking as James backed out of the parking spot. "See you around, James," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. As James drove away, his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could still hear the sound of their laughter echoing in his ears, the sting of Dylan's words cutting deep. The drive home felt longer than usual, the silence inside the car weighing heavily on him. By the time James arrived home, his mood was dark. He parked the car and sat there for a few minutes, trying to shake off the events of the day. But it was impossible. Every insult, every mocking laugh played over and over in his mind. Why did they hate him so much? Was it really just because of the car? Or was it something deeper, something he couldn't change? When he finally stepped into the house, his father was sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him. As the director of Weston Academy, his father often brought work home with him, and tonight was no different. James knew his father had noticed the tension in him, but he didn't want to talk about it, not yet. "How was school today?" his father asked without looking up from the papers. James hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was fine." His father glanced up, his eyes studying James's face for a moment, before returning to his work. James felt a pang of guilt. He had always been close to his father, but this was something he needed to handle on his own. He didn't want to lean on his father's influence to make his life at school easier. He had made a decision when he first enrolled at Weston, that he would fight his own battles and earn his place without his father's help. Later that night, as James lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. He knew the situation with Dylan was only going to get worse. The more he ignored it, the harder they would try to push him. But he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. The next few days were no different. The bullying continued, sometimes in small, subtle ways, like when someone accidentally knocked his books out of his hands in the hallway, or when his locker was mysteriously jammed shut. Other times, it was more direct. Dylan and his friends would throw insults at him in the cafeteria, making sure everyone around them could hear. One day, in class, Mr. Harper added to the humiliation. It started innocently enough. They were reviewing an assignment, and Mr. Harper was calling on students to answer questions. "James," Mr. Harper said, glancing up from his notes, "how about you explain your solution to problem number 3? James, who had always been good at math, stood up confidently and walked to the front of the room. He began to explain his answer, carefully outlining each step of his process. But halfway through his explanation, Mr. Harper interrupted him. "Well, that's certainly an interesting approach," Mr. Harper said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Though I suppose, coming from your background, I shouldn't be too surprised." The class fell silent. James froze, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. He knew exactly what Mr. Harper was implying. His background was a polite way of referring to the fact that James was a scholarship student, and worse, that he was black. It wasn't the first time a teacher had made a comment like that, but hearing it so openly in front of the entire class was a new level of humiliation. "I did the work exactly as it was outlined in the textbook," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Harper raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Perhaps next time you should focus more on following directions rather than trying to innovate. But thank you for your contribution." James returned to his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the stares of his classmates burning into him, but he refused to look up. Instead, he stared straight ahead, determined not to let Mr. Harper see how much his words had hurt. As the days wore on, James began to notice a pattern. It wasn't just Dylan and his friends. The teachers, the other students, even the staff members, seemed to have already made up their minds about him. To them, he was just another outsider, someone who didn't belong at Weston. And no matter how hard he tried to prove otherwise, it seemed like they would never see him as anything more than that. But James wasn't going to give up. He had made it this far on his own, and he wasn't about to let a few rich kids and prejudiced teachers break him. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let them win. One evening, after another grueling day at school, James sat down with a notebook and began to write. He wrote about his experiences, about the bullying, the racism, the constant pressure to prove himself. But he also wrote about his determination, about his desire to succeed on his own terms. Writing gave him an outlet, a way to process everything that was happening to him. And in the quiet of that evening, as he poured his thoughts onto the page, he made a promise to himself. No matter how hard things got, no matter how many obstacles they threw in his way, he would keep going. He would graduate from Weston, not because of his father's influence, but because he had earned it. And one day, they would all see him for who he really was. A survivor, a fighter, someone who had overcome everything they threw at him. That night, as he closed his notebook and climbed into bed, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The sound of machinery hummed around James as he stood in the garage of a local auto repair shop. The air was thick with the smell of grease and engine oil, but to him it was oddly comforting. Here, among the tools and mechanical parts, he felt more at home than he did at Weston Academy. The garage, with its worn-down walls and old equipment, was a stark contrast to the pristine, well-maintained environment of the elite school. But it was also a place where he could be himself. No judgment, no stares, just honest work. James had been working here part-time for a few weeks now, ever since he decided that relying on his father's money wasn't an option. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a sense of pride. Every evening after school, he would come here, change into his work clothes, and dive into whatever tasks the shop needed done. Sometimes it was changing oil, other times it was more complicated repairs. He didn't mind the work. In fact, he enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about fixing something with his hands, seeing the immediate results of his effort. The people here treated him differently than they did at Weston. His boss, Mike, a gruff but kind-hearted man in his late 50s, didn't care about where James went to school or what kind of car he drove. To Mike, James was just a hard worker, and that was enough. "Hey, kid, hand me that wrench, will you?" Mike's voice broke through James's thoughts. He turned, grabbing the tool from a nearby workbench and passing it over. Mike grunted his thanks as he tightened a bolt on the engine he was working on. "You're doing good work here, James. Not many kids your age would stick around for this kind of stuff." James smiled slightly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thanks, Mike. I want to do something that's my own, you know? Something I can look back on and say, I did that." Mike nodded. Not one for long speeches. "Yeah, I get that. And you're earning every penny, kid. That's what matters." James appreciated Mike's straightforward nature. It was a stark contrast to the superficiality he often encountered at school. Here, there was no pretense. If you worked hard, you were respected, no matter who you were or where you came from. He worked until late into the evening, losing track of time as he immersed himself in the repairs. When he finally checked the clock, it was already past 8 p.m., and the garage was starting to close up. Waving goodbye to Mike and the other workers, James climbed into his old car and started the engine. The familiar sputter of the motor reminded him of why he was here. Every dollar he earned was going towards saving up for a new car, one he could buy with his own money. As he drove home, the streetlights casting long shadows over the road, James reflected on his day at school. The bullying hadn't stopped, and neither had the racism. Dylan and his friends continued their taunts, throwing out racist jokes and sneers whenever they saw him. And Mr. Harper still found ways to belittle him in class, making snide comments about his background or subtly questioning his intelligence. But despite it all, James had found solace in the garage. Every time he stepped into that shop, he left behind the judgment and the pressure. He wasn't the black kid from Weston there. He was just James, a kid who knew how to work hard and get things done. When he finally pulled into the driveway of his home, the house was dark, save for a light in the kitchen. His father was likely still awake, as he often stayed up late working on school matters. James knew that his father had noticed the tension building in him, but he hadn't pushed him to talk about it. They had a silent understanding. James would handle things on his own terms. Entering the house quietly, James made his way to the kitchen where his father sat at the table, surrounded by papers. The faint glow of the lamp highlighted the tired lines on his father's face. But even in his exhaustion, there was a sense of quiet authority about him. "Long day at the shop?" his father asked, looking up from his work. James nodded, grabbing a glass of water from the counter. "Yeah, but it was good. I liked the work." His father studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "I'm proud of you, James. You're doing something most kids your age wouldn't even think about." James shrugged, trying to brush off the praise. "I just want to make my own way, you know? I don't want to be seen as relying on you." His father's expression softened, and for a moment, the weight of the director's title seemed to lift from him. "You've never been one to take the easy road, James. I've always admired that about you. Just know that if things ever get too difficult, you don't have to do it alone." James appreciated the sentiment, but he remained firm in his decision. "I know, Dad, but I need to do this. I need to prove to myself that I can." His father didn't push further, simply giving a small nod of understanding before turning back to his work. The conversation left James feeling more grounded, more determined than ever. He had always known that his father was there for him, but this was his journey to take, his challenges to overcome. The next few weeks at Weston were much of the same. The bullying from Dylan and his group had escalated, with small pranks and insults becoming a regular occurrence. One morning, James arrived at school to find his locker covered in graffiti, a crude drawing accompanied by a racial slur. He stood there, staring at it for a long moment, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. A few students walked by, whispering and giggling to themselves, clearly enjoying the spectacle. James didn't react. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he walked to the front office, reported the vandalism, and went on with his day as if nothing had happened. Inside, though, the anger simmered. It wasn't just the graffiti, or the slurs, or the snide comments. It was the constant reminder that, to them, he didn't belong. Every insult, every joke at his expense, was a way of telling him that he was different, that he was an outsider. But James wasn't going to let that stop him. He threw himself into his work at the garage, staying late into the evenings, working weekends whenever he could. The more he worked, the more he earned, and the closer he got to his goal. Each dollar he saved was another step toward buying a car of his own, one that wasn't a hand-me-down from his father, one that he had earned with his own hard work. In the garage, he found a sense of peace that eluded him at school. The repetitive nature of the work, tightening bolts, changing oil, fixing engines, gave him something to focus on, something tangible. Every time he completed a task, he felt a small sense of accomplishment, a reminder that he was capable of achieving his goals, even when the world around him seemed determined to tear him down. One Saturday, as James was working a particularly long shift, Mike approached him with a curious look on his face. "You've been saving up for something, haven't you?" he asked, leaning against the workbench. James wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "Yeah, I want to buy a car. Something better than the one I've got now." Mike chuckled. "Well, you've certainly been putting in the hours for it. I'm impressed, kid. Most people would have given up by now." James smiled slightly, grateful for the support. "I just want to do it on my own, without relying on anyone else." Mike's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed to understand exactly what James meant. "Well, you're getting close. Keep at it, and you'll get there." James left the garage that evening, feeling more determined than ever. He was close, so close to achieving something that was entirely his own. The bullying, the racism, the constant pressure at school. None of it mattered when he was in the garage, working toward his goal. It was the one place where he felt in control, where he could see the results of his efforts. As the weeks passed, the divide between his life at school and his life at the garage became more pronounced. At Weston, he was still the target of insults and jokes, still the kid who didn't belong. But at the garage, he was respected, valued for his work ethic and dedication. It was a strange contrast, living in two worlds that seemed so far apart from each other. One day, as James was driving home from the garage, he caught sight of a car dealership on the side of the road. The cars in the lot gleamed under the fading evening light, their polished exteriors reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sunset. For a moment, James considered pulling over just to take a look. But he wasn't ready yet. Not yet. He needed a little more time, a little more money. Soon, though. Soon he would walk into that dealership and buy a car of his own. And when he did, it wouldn't be because of his father's money or influence. It would be because of him, because he had worked for it, earned it with his own hands. That night, as James lay in bed, he allowed himself a small smile. He was getting closer to his goal, closer to proving to himself that he could make his own way in the world. And no matter what Dylan or anyone else said, that was something they could never take away from him. It was an ordinary morning at Weston Academy, or at least it seemed that way to everyone else. For James, however, The tension in the air was almost palpable. He had grown used to the routine of mockery and casual racism, but something about today felt different. The insults had grown more frequent, the stares more intense, and the whispers more noticeable. And the campus, usually filled with the hum of students' conversations, felt more like a stage set, with him as the main character in a drama he hadn't asked to be a part of. James made his way through the hallways, his gaze fixed straight ahead, trying to ignore the constant stream of side glances and quiet remarks that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He had learned to brush it off, to focus on his studies and the work he did outside of school. But today, that thin layer of self-protection felt like it was starting to crack. He walked into class, and as usual, found his seat at the back. Mr. Harper, standing at the front of the room, was already going over the day's lesson. James took out his notebook, trying to lose himself in the routine of note-taking and solving problems. It was a methodical way to escape the reality around him. But halfway through the class, something happened that would change everything. The door to the classroom opened abruptly, and in walked the school's administrative assistant, Mrs. Jenkins. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, and her presence in a classroom typically meant something important. "Mr. Harper, I need to borrow James for a moment," she said, her voice calm and professional. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at James. His heart skipped a beat. What could this be about? He nodded and stood up, his movements slow and deliberate as he packed up his things. The weight of every student's gaze bore down on him as he followed Mrs. Jenkins out of the room, leaving behind a room full of curious whispers. As they walked down the hallway, Mrs. Jenkins remained silent, her face unreadable. James, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel the growing knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Had something happened? Was he in trouble? He had no idea what to expect. When they reached the administrative office, Mrs. Jenkins gestured for James to step inside. And there, waiting for him, was his father, Mr. Walker, the director of Weston Academy. James felt his stomach drop. His father rarely summoned him during school hours, and when he did, it was never without reason. But what stood out to James the most wasn't just the fact that his father was there, but the look on his face, a look of quiet disappointment, tinged with something James couldn't quite place. "James, sit down," his father said, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. The air in the office felt thick with unspoken tension as James sat down. He couldn't help but notice that the blinds were half drawn, giving the room an unusually dark and somber feel. His father's usual air of calm authority seemed more intense today, and James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His father leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath before speaking. "I've been hearing things, James, things about what's been happening in school, about how you've been treated." James remained silent, unsure of where this conversation was going. He had never spoken to his father about the bullying. He didn't want his father's position to be the reason anything changed for him at Weston. He wanted to face these challenges on his own, without any intervention. "I didn't want to involve you," James finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can handle it." His father's expression softened, but there was still a hard edge to his tone. "It's not just about handling it, it's about what's right and wrong. You shouldn't have to endure that kind of treatment, and it's my responsibility as the director of this school to ensure that every student is treated fairly, especially my son." James's heart sank at the last part. He had worked so hard to keep his identity hidden, to be just another student at Weston, without the weight of his father's title hanging over him. But now, It seemed like that secret was about to come out. "I know you want to do this on your own, and I respect that," his father continued. "But there are some things you can't face alone. I won't let this continue." Before James could respond, the door to the office opened again, and in walked Dylan, flanked by 2 other students, his closest friends. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and fear, clearly not expecting to be summoned to the director's office. Dylan, in particular, looked like he had just been hit with a ton of bricks. "Sit down, boys," Mr. Walker said, his tone now sharp and commanding. The 3 of them sat, glancing nervously between James and his father. The tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Walker didn't waste any time. "I've been made aware of some incidents that have occurred recently. Bullying, racial slurs, vandalism, all directed at my son." The moment the words left his father's mouth, the shock on Dylan's face was unmistakable. His eyes widened in disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just heard. The other 2 students exchanged panicked glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. "Wait, your son?" Dylan stammered, finally finding his voice. He turned to James, the realization hitting him like a freight train. "James is your son?" Mr. Walker's expression remained stern as he nodded. "Yes, James is my son, and the fact that you didn't know that doesn't excuse your behavior. What you've done is unacceptable, regardless of who he is." Dylan's face went pale. The weight of his actions seemed to settle on him all at once, and for the first time since James had met him, he looked genuinely afraid. I didn't know," Dylan muttered, his voice barely audible. "If I'd known, I would have—" "You would have what?" Mr. Walker interrupted, his tone sharp. "You would have treated him differently because of who his father is." "That's not the lesson you should take from this, Dylan. The issue here isn't whether or not you knew James was my son. The issue is how you treated him in the first place." The room fell silent as the gravity of Mr. Walker's words sank in. James sat there, watching the scene unfold, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. After all, Dylan and his friends were finally being held accountable for their actions. But another part of him felt a deep sense of discomfort. This wasn't how he had wanted things to happen. He didn't want his father's authority to be the reason these boys stopped bullying him. Mr. Walker leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I want to make something very clear to all of you. This school is a place for learning and growth, and that means treating every student with respect, regardless of their background. Bullying, racism, these things will not be tolerated here. Do I make myself clear?" The 3 boys nodded, their faces pale and their expressions solemn. "Good. Now, I expect each of you to take responsibility for your actions. There will be consequences, and you will be held accountable. But more than that, I want you to learn from this. This behavior cannot continue." Mr. Walker dismissed the boys, and they left the office in silence, their heads hanging low. James watched them go, feeling a strange sense of relief but also a lingering discomfort. He had never wanted his father to get involved like this, but at the same time, he knew that it had to be done. Once the door closed behind them, his father turned to him. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, James. I should have stepped in sooner." James shook his head. "I didn't want you to step in at all. I wanted to handle it myself." "I understand," his father said softly, "but sometimes you need help, whether you want it or not." James nodded, though the weight of the situation still hung heavily over him. He stood up, ready to leave the office, but before he did, he turned to his father. "I'm not mad at you," James said quietly. I don't want people to treat me differently because of who you are." His father gave him a small, understanding smile. "They won't, James. Not if you keep showing them who you really are." By the time James returned to class, The news had already spread like wildfire. Whispers followed him down the hallways. But this time, they weren't mocking. Instead, there was an undercurrent of shock, surprise, even respect. The entire dynamic had shifted. The students who had once ridiculed him now looked at him with a new sense of awe, as though discovering he was the director's son had changed everything. But for James, nothing had changed at all. He was still the same person, still determined to make his own way, to prove himself without relying on his father's influence. Later that day, as he walked to his locker, he noticed Dylan standing nearby, waiting for him. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by an awkward silence. "Hey, James," Dylan muttered, avoiding eye contact. I'm sorry about everything." James looked at him, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to lash out, to tell Dylan that his apology didn't matter. But another part of him knew that this was the moment where he could take control, not through anger or revenge, but through grace. "It's fine," James said simply. "I've already moved on." Dylan blinked, clearly not expecting such a calm response. "Really?" James nodded. "Yeah. And for the record, I wouldn't have wanted you to treat me any differently, even if you had known who my father was." Dylan didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded awkwardly before walking away. As James watched him go, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had always wanted to prove himself on his own terms. And now, despite everything, he felt like he had. The days following the revelation of James's identity as the director's son passed in a blur. The dynamic at Western Academy shifted drastically. Where once he had been invisible to most of the student body, an outsider, only acknowledged for mockery and insults, now he was someone to be reckoned with, someone worthy of their attention, but not for the reasons James had hoped. Everywhere he went, the whispers followed him, but this time they were filled with a mix of awe and guilt. Those who had mocked his car, laughed at his clothes, and made snide comments about his background were now scrambling to get on his good side. They smiled at him in the halls, greeted him with newfound politeness, and even invited him to sit with them during lunch. But James saw through it all. Their sudden change in behavior wasn't about respect for him. It was about fear of his father's influence. The teachers, too, had started treating him differently. Mr. Harper, who had once taken every opportunity to belittle James in front of the class, now acted as though James was one of his prized students. He asked for James's opinion in discussions, praised his work openly, and even offered extra help after class. It was as though his identity as the director's son had suddenly made him worthy of their approval. But James felt nothing but frustration. This wasn't the respect he had been working for. It wasn't the validation he had hoped to earn through his hard work and determination. It was hollow, built on the privilege of his father's position rather than on his own merit. And the more people tried to cozy up to him, the more he felt the weight of his decision to keep his identity hidden in the first place. One afternoon, as James made his way through the courtyard, Dylan approached him once again. Unlike the first time they had spoken after the revelation, this time Dylan seemed more at ease, as though he had finally accepted the new reality of who James was. "Hey, James," Dylan called out, walking up to him with a hesitant smile. James looked up from the notebook he was carrying and nodded. "Dylan?" There was a moment of awkward silence between them, and James could see Dylan struggling to find the right words. He knew what was coming. Another apology, perhaps a plea to wipe the slate clean now that they stood on supposedly equal footing. But James wasn't sure he had it in him to have this conversation again. "I just wanted to say, I really am sorry about everything. I didn't mean to—" James cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "Dylan, I told you before, I've already moved on." Dylan blinked, taken aback by the interruption. "Yeah, I know, but I guess I just didn't expect you to be the director's son. If I had known, things would have been different, And there it was. the same sentiment that had been echoed by so many others over the past few days. If they had known about his father's position, they wouldn't have treated him the way they had. But that was exactly the problem, wasn't it? James didn't want to be treated differently because of who his father was. "That's exactly why I didn't tell anyone," James said, his gaze steady. "I didn't want things to be different because of my father." Dylan shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting that response. "Yeah, I get that, but I guess it's just hard for some people to separate who you are from who your dad is." James sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "Look, Dylan, I don't care what people think about my dad. I came here to prove myself, to prove that I belong here because of my own hard work, not because of my family. That's all I've ever wanted." Dylan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I never really thought about it like that." "Most people don't," James said, his voice quiet. "But that's the point. I don't want to rely on my father's influence. I never have, and I never will." Dylan was silent for a moment, clearly trying to process everything James had said. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "I respect that, James. I really do." James gave him a small nod, appreciating the sentiment, even if it didn't quite make up for everything that had happened. "Thanks." With that, Dylan walked away, leaving James standing alone in the courtyard. The conversation left a strange taste in his mouth, an odd mix of closure and dissatisfaction. He had forgiven Dylan, but the wounds of the past few months hadn't completely healed. They couldn't be erased with a few apologies and polite words. And deep down, James knew that. The next day, James found himself face to face with Mr. Harper in class. The teacher, who had once reveled in making James feel small, now seemed overly eager to please him. During the lesson, Mr. Harper called on James for every question, praising his answers and nodding approvingly at his every response. It was as though the old Mr. Harper had been replaced by someone entirely different, someone who now saw James as an important figure in the class. But instead of feeling proud, James felt a growing sense of discomfort. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't genuine, that Mr. Harper's sudden change in behavior had nothing to do with James's academic performance, and everything to do with who his father was. At the end of the class, as the other students filed out of the room, Mr. Harper called out to James. "James, could I have a word with you?" James hesitated for a moment before walking up to the teacher's desk. Mr. Harper was smiling, an expression that seemed oddly out of place on his normally stern face. "I just wanted to tell you that I've been very impressed with your work lately," Mr. Harper said, his tone warm and accommodating. "You've shown a lot of improvement." James stared at him, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I haven't done anything differently, Mr. Harper. I've been doing the same work all semester." Mr. Harper's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Well, whatever it is, you're clearly on the right track. Keep it up, and I'm sure you'll continue to excel." James didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked Mr. Harper in the eye, his expression serious. "Are you saying this because of my work, or because of who my father is?" Mr. Harper's smile froze, and for a brief moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. Then, after an awkward pause, he gave a tight-lipped smile. "Your work speaks for itself, James." James didn't believe him. Without another word, he turned and left the classroom, his mind racing with frustration. It was exactly what he had feared. People weren't respecting him for who he was. They were respecting him for who his father was. That evening, James sat in the garage where he worked after school, trying to clear his head. The familiar sounds of clanking tools and the hum of machinery helped ground him, pulling him away from the tension of the day. This was the one place where things still felt real, where his hard work was appreciated for what it was, not for who he was. As he worked on a car engine, wiping away grease from his hands, Mike, his boss, approached him. You've been quiet today, kid. Something on your mind? James sighed, leaning against the car. Just school stuff. It's complicated. Mike gave a knowing nod. Figured as much. I heard about what happened. Tough break, having your dad as the head honcho, huh? James looked up, surprised. You heard? Mike chuckled. News like that travels fast, kid. But don't worry. Around here, we don't care who your dad is. You do good work, that's all that matters. James smiled, grateful for Mike's straightforward attitude. That's all I want, to be judged for my work, not for my family. Mike slapped him on the shoulder, grinning. Well, you're in the right place for that. Around here, hard work is all that counts. James nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where he didn't have to prove anything to anyone except himself. It was here that he had found his own worth, far removed from the privilege and status that his father's name carried at school. A few weeks later, as James was walking through the halls of Weston, he noticed a group of students lingering near his locker. They weren't laughing or whispering this time. Instead, they looked uncertain, even nervous. One of them, a girl from his class named Emily, stepped forward, clutching her books awkwardly. "Hey, James," she said hesitantly, we just wanted to say that we're sorry. For everything. We shouldn't have treated you the way we did." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden apology. He hadn't expected this. "It wasn't right," Emily continued, "and we know that now. We hope you can forgive us." James studied their faces, seeing genuine remorse in their expressions. For a brief moment, he considered brushing them off, telling them that it didn't matter anymore. But then he remembered what he had told Dylan, that he had already moved on. "I've already forgiven you," James said, his voice steady. "But just so you know, I wouldn't have wanted you to treat me any differently, even if you had known who my father was." The group exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly still grappling with the weight of their actions. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, we get that." With that, they walked away, leaving James standing alone by his locker. He watched them go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, closure, but also a lingering frustration. This wasn't how he had wanted things to play out, but at least now, things were settling down. As he walked down the hall, James knew that he had made the right choice. He would never rely on his father's influence to get ahead. He would continue to work hard, to earn everything on his own terms, and that, in the end, was what mattered most. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Leave comments, I value your opinion, and also watch other videos. There are many more interesting things to come.